I'd like to talk a little bit now about biosphere objects. Now, biosphere objects are different than the mesh objects, whereas a biosphere is an object made up of multiple spheres, which can be modified within the biosphere section, and only biosphere objects can be modified in the biosphere section of Amorphium. So to create a biosphere object, you use the biospheres tool in the composer window, and once you have it selected, you can just click and drag anywhere in your workspace window by clicking and dragging out like so. Now I've created this biosphere object. Now if I had other objects in my scene and I tried to choose them in the biospheres window, they'd be grayed out because if they're not a biosphere object, you can't modify it in this section. So now I'm in the biosphere section here. I can choose the biosphere object that I want to work with, and it shows up here in the window. Now you'll notice this little black box. This little black box represents the way I can select and move this particular sphere. So if I use the selection tool here, I can select that, and that's as if I was going to move groups of them together. I can select multiple, but that's what this little box represents, this object, and the handle, so to speak, that I can use to control it. I can create more spheres by using the Add Biosphere tool, and when I add more, I can do that by just clicking and dragging out in the window here. And as I add more and start to move these by clicking on the box with the Move tool, you'll see them pool together, and this allows me to be able to create shapes that would have been harder to create by just adding spheres and kind of blobbing them together, so to speak. So now each one of these spheres that I'm making here has its own parameters for radius, energy, and so on. So as I move these, let me just show you here. So I'm starting to create sort of this, just make sort of a hand here. How about that? Go ahead and pull these guys closer together. Kind of some kind of alien hand I'm making right now. So now, as I'm blobbing these guys together, each one of these has different parameters you can modify. So, for example, this is radius. So, as I click on these tools, you'll see these little bars here, and they are like slider bars for the parameters for each of these tools. So, if I wanted to change the radius on an object, I just select the radius tool and then grab the larger box and drag it, and you can see I can make the radius really big, or I can make it really small. And so that's just changing how the actual radius of the sphere, of the biosphere itself. Now energy is different, even though it looks like it's affecting the same way by creating maybe slightly bigger or smaller sphere. It's actually changing the energy of the sphere, and what it's doing is it's giving a higher energy value to that sphere, and what that means is that that sphere will retain its spherical shape more, and it'll have more pull on the other spheres, which will allow it to retain its shape but also pull from the other ones more. If I were to drop this down to really small, it's going to retain its shape even less and start to, as I push, let me move it here so you can see it a little better, it'll retain its shape even less. It's going to blob more into the one next to it. Now, one of the interesting things about energy is that you can actually go to a negative energy by just dragging it the other direction. Now, you don't visibly see the object anymore because it's a negative value, but if I move this towards the others, you can see it start to push away the other blobs, which can be very useful for creating holes or flattening out areas that might be too round. You can make a negative sphere to kind of push against the others. And of course, I'm only working in one plane here, but I can actually move, rotate around and grab this guy and, you know, push from a different direction, or move these, you know, in 3D space. So it's not just, you know, a two-dimensional view. Now these other two down here affect the actual shape of the object, and so if I change the oblateness of an object, what that's going to do is change whether it's more hot dog shaped or more pancake shaped. And this can be useful for making, like if you're going to make fingers, you might want to make them more oblate so that they're, more hot dog shaped. Now, once you have changed the shape, then the radius of your biosphere, will be noticed as you change it. Of course, if it's a perfect sphere and you rotate it, you're not going to see the change, because if a perfect sphere is rotated, you won't see it change. Now, each of these values, all these values for what I've been changing here, can be modified numerically if you want to make sure that, like, say, this particular biosphere and this biosphere over here are exactly the same radius. If you choose the numeric tool and then click on the biosphere you want, it brings up the options for that, the numeric options for that particular biosphere. So I can change anything from position, rotation, radius, energy, and oblateness, all right here within inside, and change it numerically. And that works for any of them. So for example, if I make the radius on this particular one here 30, and click OK, you can see now it's changed the radius to be 30, so it's much larger. So now if I go back out into Composer, and I'll go ahead and scale this down a little so it's a little easier for you to see it, you can see my shape now is here in my workspace. You'll notice in the camera view here in my project that it's treated as one object, even though there's multiple biospheres inside the object itself. And these can be animated, of course, which I'll talk about later in the animation section a little bit more. But you can animate these in Composer. But you'll notice that I can move it as one object. That's because Amorphium looks at it as one object, even though you're modifying it within biospheres. Now, sometimes when you're making biospheres, say for example, if I make this guy really small, and I come back in here, and I go to display wireframe. Now, if I zoom in on this, you can see where you're getting some weird angular polygons here, and that's because the density of the mesh is at a certain density, and if you start getting really small biospheres, you might get some weird angular polygons trying to be created. Now you can change that and make that more smooth. Like if you start getting really detailed, like little fingers and antennas on your little character's head, and they're not getting smooth enough, you can change that by changing the actual resolution of this mesh. And to see that a little clearly, I'll go ahead and go to wireframe view here. Now the mesh itself, you can see the wireframe there. If I were to change this by either control clicking on the Mac or right clicking on the PC on the name in the project window or on the actual object in your window, you'll see that you'll have a pop-up with a properties option. If you choose that, you'll notice that you have a bunch of properties for that object. Well, one of the properties is resolution. And what this allows you to do is change the amount of detail in this mesh. So if I wanted less detail, say it's too dense and it's moving real slow and I don't need that much geometry, I can change this down. So if I make this less dense, you'll see that there's less geometry there now that to use to create the object. Whereas if I were to come into properties here and change the resolution, say maybe to 70, because I want more detail, it'll take a little longer, of course, but since the mesh is more detailed now, and if I go to shaded here, you can see it's much smoother and it's getting more of the detail in that shape. Now, of course, it's going to move a lot slower here, but you'll get better detail in your meshes. Now, one really good tip is as you start to build your objects and you start to make, say, maybe a biosphere object that you're going to render out, and you realize, oh, my density needs to be around 70 or higher to get the detail I want. Well, what I suggest is when you start animating biosphere objects, once you get the density that you know is going to work, go ahead and change your properties resolution down to something more workable at first, even though it won't maybe be what you want right in the final render. But while you're doing your animations, use a lower res so you have a speeded up preview. Then right before you render, change your resolution higher and then hit render after doing that. So that way you can lower the density just temporarily just to be able to speed up your workflow, and then change your resolution back right before render time. The last thing I'd like to mention about biosphere objects is the fact that because it is a biosphere object, if I go into Tools and try to modify it, you'll notice that it is grayed out. And it's the same for all your effects, height, shop, morph, all that. And that's the reason that is because being that biospheres are basically objects within an object, because it's its own unique type of modeling format, you're not allowed to use these other tools on it. Now, if you wanted to use these tools, you can do that by converting it to a mesh object first. And once you've done that, which is by using the little convert to mesh object tool here, convert to mesh, if I do that, and of course there it goes, took it a little bit, but once I do that, then I can modify it in the tools window. So now I can use my tools or effects. So for example, if I were to do, say, like a bulge on this, you can see that I'm now able to use the effects and then also the tools. Like if I want to brush on the surface, I can actually brush on the surface of the object now. And that's because I converted it to a mesh object first. Now I can't go back to biospheres. Once it's converted, you can't go back. So make sure that you have exactly what you want to start out with first before you convert. So that if you want to be able to create a biosphere object to use as your starting point, you can do that and then convert it into a mesh object. And you'll see that once it's converted, it'll be called mesh converted, and the icon will be different now, showing that it is a mesh object. So if I undo that, now it's back to a biosphere. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to convert your object to a mesh object, you won't be able to modify it in the biospheres window anymore. And that's basically the way you would work with inside biospheres, and how the basics for creating biosphere objects works within the biospheres section of Amorphium.